Kom og sitte foran. Okay, good morning everyone on a cold November morning in Norway. Almost dark still, but good to see a lot of morning birds here, early birds. Just a few practicalities firstly. There are emergency exits here and in the back. And this event will be recorded, so I hope that's okay for everyone. And again, welcome to this event, the Future of Aid 2040. Are we ready to transform? That's the question that we're asking today, hoping to have some answers and some ideas together with you. But first of all, I would like to introduce NORAD's Director General to give some welcome and opening remarks. Gunn-Jorid Roseth.
Thank you. Is it on? Yes, good. Oh, good morning and welcome to NORAD. And wow, what a way to start a day. It's the question I think that we're all thinking about all the time. The ones, and I assume everyone in this room, as I am, are passionate about quality development assistance, thinking about where can we, make the difference, how can we be better, how can we improve partnerships, and I think also the sense of urgency. So thank you to everybody involved here, and thank you for bringing us together and also to putting this question on the agenda. Very important. So my name is Gunn-Jorid Roseth and I'm the Director General of NORAD, so I'm very glad to host you here this morning. And I think it's a great honor for us to host such an important discussion about the future of aid. And of course we all know the backdrop and the situation the world is in and the challenging times for the aid system. As you all know, the aid landscape is rapidly changing. The large cuts we see surrounding us, of course, with the USA, that's the prominent one. And we see also reductions of ODA across the board. And the donor landscape is also changing. And we see that multilateralism is also under pressure. And I've said this on other occasions also, that of course we worry about the decrease of funding, but also about the language that is used, that it's okay to say that development assistance doesn't work, that the SDGs is something that is sort of, the agenda is no longer valid, and things that not only issues like gender equality and more sort of politically, and which is of course also bizarre that in 2025 gender equality is suddenly a very heated or contested topic, but also that the sustainability agenda and the sustainable development goals are sort of put in the spotlight. So we also need to keep speaking about this and supporting each other about the effect and importance of development assistance. We see that countries and organizations are affected and exposed to aid cuts, and then I think it brings me to the point that with less funding, efficiency is more important than ever. Getting the most out of every crown and every dollar. In order to do this, we need knowledge, we need data about what works, so that we can direct funding where it will have the largest impact. But we also know that in times of geopolitical tension and emphasis on national interests, aid tends to become conditional, tightly earmarked, fragmented, and tied to national commercial and security interests. Balancing refugee costs at home, global public goods, inequality, and the increasing pressure to respond to donors' national interests is a significant challenge. As countries are reducing their official development aid, we need to innovate development financing. The private sector will be increasingly important, and just this week I participated in a panel hosted by UNICEF, which brought together leaders from business and also philanthropy about how we can combine our strengths to ensure that we reach the Sustainable Development Goals. And we know that aid works, but we have to showcase it and tell it to everybody that it works. We have to show that it works, why it works, and how it works. And I think also, as we will discuss today, development financing will look different in the years to come. Cooperation and partnerships across public and private sectors will be essentials. And we, as NORAD, welcome, and we also hope to facilitate open debate about the future of aid. We need to communicate to a wide audience of both decision makers and the general public the value and relevance of development cooperation. How can we cut through the complexity? And I think also we as Norway and NORAD, we have an extra responsibility these days where the cuts are so large, because also it's not only the funding, but people are leaving in partners in other countries that used to have strong hubs of experts and also providing funding to research. So I think for us as a large donor and with a very strong development agency, we also have to sort of carry some of that weight now to ask the right questions, to find the right partners, but to also do that thinking here in this building. So I'm looking forward to reading the findings in the report and to continue working with all of you to ensure a just and impactful aid system for the future. And I wish you all the best of luck for the discussions to come. And thank you again for bringing us together here. And I'm happy to host you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gunn-Jorid. And my name is Katrine Rådim from NORCAP, and I'll try to guide us through the discussions today. And I'm very happy to now be able to introduce the director of IARAN, Ailid Kennedy. IARAN is behind the Future of Aid report, together with partners, so a big welcome to you.
Well, I want to start by saying thank you very much to our partners at NORCAP, who have been firm partners throughout the project, contributing in guidance along with other colleagues as well, and our hosts here at NORAD. It's really a delight to be able to join you here this morning. I think what's interesting about the introduction, the word challenging times, is probably the height of British understatement for where we are at the moment. I think this project has been many years in the planning. We kicked it off in sort of mid-2024, which was a year where we were starting to see cuts already, but obviously hadn't had the seismic shift that took place in 2025. And managing this changing context while we've been doing this research has been really fascinating. We've sort of seen what were some of the themes and challenges that predated the shock in 2025, as well as what's been consistent through that. It's also been a huge privilege because this project is ultimately at its foundation a consultation. We are really just facilitators of this discussion, and running some of the focus groups and the conversations have been like collective therapy sessions at times, where we have had people coming forward with what they're seeing in their everyday life and trying to reckon and make sense of that with colleagues from around the world. And that consultation, we try and continue in every engagement that we have. So a little bit of housekeeping, if I can. Tell you what, let me use this. So we will be using Slido today, for those of you joining online, and also those of you here in the room. I have a couple of questions for you on Slido as we go through the presentation. So please do scan this QR code or go to slido.com and enter the meeting code FOA 2040 to be able to join us online. You can be loading questions onto the platform at any time during the presentation, as well as during the panel discussion that will follow. So I really encourage you to join us because we're, as always, very eager to hear how these outputs resonate in different places and where people's focus and understanding is. So with that, I want to begin by doing an overview of the project itself. As we said, the ambition of the study was always very grand. And what we hoped to be able to do was to achieve 3 concrete aims. To analyze the potential changes in the global context and the humanitarian ecosystem by 2040. To identify concrete pathways for organizational transformation applicable to any actor working in the sector, and to develop tools and guidelines to support organizations in undertaking this transformative journey. But one of the things that has been critical is from the very outset, we have had a diverse steering committee, the representation of which you can see here, comprised of international organizations, local organizations, those who are more research inclined, more operational, as well as donors. And what this has helped us to do is by continually consulting and using these partners as a sounding board, we've been able to try and hone in as much as possible on what are the real questions that people have to answer today, tomorrow, and going forward. Because the ambition of this study is that it is practically useful. Some of you may remember that about 10 years ago, we released a study looking at the future of aid in 2030. And while that report was quite widely used, some of the feedback and the criticism which was justly applied to it was that it sort of presented an end of state, but didn't necessarily help organizations think about how to get from where we are today to those points in terms of the end of state. And that's something that we wanted to rectify with this project, which is why it's being delivered in 2 phases. Phase 1 of the project has already been completed, and you can see the published outputs of that. We have a causal-layered analysis of the aid sector in 2025, which is a way of breaking down our system, decomposing it, and looking at it at multiple different levels, as well as the Future of Aid 2040 Foresight report that was released in September. But critically, we are now moving on to phase 2 of the project, where we're launching a new round of consultations, both online as well as locally run workshops, where we're hoping to address these final 2 aims. Well, we'll be talking about what comes next. What do these scenarios mean? How are they translated into decision making? And critically, we're also working with partners now to develop a toolkit, which we will be making freely and publicly available, so that when we come to our final publication date in April of 2026, not only do we have the analytical side of it, which has been built by input from so many people, but it also comes with a guide, with a toolkit, which should help organizations to be able to operationalize those decisions themselves. As a consultant, we're always happy for business, of course, but this project was not intended to be a major driver of that. The intention is really that we provide everyone with the tools and resources they need to be able to leave on that journey themselves and to be able to lead their staff in these conversations. So that is our ambition. And in delivering it, one of the things that we've really tried to do is build a wide and broad community. So in phase 1 of the study, we had nearly 900 people feeding in from a very wide collective of actors within the humanitarian space. Participants were predominantly from sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Asia, comprising 70% of all respondents. We had a relatively balanced gender balance between it, with 54% of the participants being male and 44% female. Really critically, we were very privileged to have 40% of respondents who had lived experience of crises. Understanding these dynamics has allowed us to privilege their voices at times in the project and focus not just on some of the systems and analytical questions that come through, but also how aid feels to people who have experienced it and the way in which they live that every day. It's a wildly different experience, as I'm sure all of us in this room can understand, to be an aid practitioner and to both be a practitioner who has experience of what it's like to be on the other side as well. And that viewpoint is something that we were not comfortable proceeding without. So investing in making sure that we had this kind of input as really a foundation of the project was a critical component that we're delighted to have achieved. Finally, the largest cohort of participants that we gathered worked for local and national NGOs, CBOs, or other local movements. That was about 40% of the participants that we had. Next slide, please. I'm going to jump straight into the content because I don't have a lot of time and there's a huge amount of it contained within the study. My favorite part of the Future of Aid study was the process that we went through to build this causal layered analysis, because part of what that does is ask people not just what they see in the news every day, but to dig deeper underneath the aid system, to the structural drivers, to the worldviews that they think define it, and critically to the stories, myths, and metaphors that they think describe aid and what it feels like. These are 3 stories which represent really sort of the broad themes that were represented through all of the answers that we got. And so I want to talk through them each. The first one is around overwhelm. We received a lot of stories that talk about how overwhelming it is to both work and be in a context of needing aid. A colleague from Kenya defined it as saying, "I'll never be able to reach the horizon. It is a never-ending march. We help one person to improve the situation and the need only increases." Another group of stories which were pretty consistent through many of the responses, were of an us versus them dynamic, representing some of the worldviews that came through that international aid is still stemmed and founded in ideas of colonialism, of white saviorism. This us versus them dynamic was captured very brutally and honestly by a colleague from the Philippines, saying that international aid feels like a thief leaving some coins for the victim to buy food. And finally, we had a group of stories which are defined by what we called hope through collective action. And these stories use the myths and metaphors and the images mainly of aid as a lifeline, a rope, a beacon, a lighthouse, of showing the potential of aid and solidarity to aid and support people in times affected by crises. Humanitarian aid is a lifeline, a rope thrown across a river, connecting the stranded community to a source of safety, resources, and hope. The lifeline may take different forms: food, water, shelter, or medical care, but its primary role is to keep people from drowning, to give them the chance to survive long enough to rebuild their lives. I think this is one of the most interesting areas of the report because it uses the words directly of people affected by crises who speak far more powerfully than I ever could. And one of the things that we found as we go through this process is that different stories, different takes, different themes resonate more with different audiences and in different times. So if you can all take out your phones, we're going to have our first Slido engagement. So it's always interesting for us to hear from audiences when we ask you, which one of these themes of stories resonates most with you? In your work, in what you're seeing every day, sometimes in what you're reading in the news or experiencing in your daily life. As you can imagine, which theme comes through most powerfully varies quite widely depending on where we're having this conversation and who is in the room. So that in and of itself has been a very useful experience for us to understand because it gives us a little bit of a snapshot of where communities and audiences are in different times. It's always heartening to see hope through collective action coming out strongly within these responses. And I think it speaks a lot to what we have seen in many consultations, which is that individually, as people who work and have dedicated their lives, their careers to aid and development, what we see is that at the individual level, hope through collective action stems very strongly as the motivation for people who come to the sector. What we have found through the process of analysis, though, which is what we're coming to next, is that overwhelm is often the result of a system that's under-resourced, and us versus them is also a continual and prominent piece of our story, which sometimes we don't spend enough time to reckon with when we're talking about change and moving away from true transformation. So what we wanted to explore briefly, because as I said, we are on a tight time frame this morning with so many interesting speakers to come, I just wanted to set the context by giving a short presentation into the scenarios that are in the report. As we said, the report is multi-layered, and these stories formed a foundation of the study. And as you read the report, you'll see that we used stories such as those ones to ground each of the 4 scenarios that I'm going to present here this morning. But we built these scenarios by essentially asking people within that Future of Aid community what they saw were the most important drivers of change, whether they saw significant challenges, opportunities for transformation, and how they balance those different components. And using their input over a series of seminars and questionnaires and surveys, we have built the set of scenarios which we validated with the community before publication. And it resulted in essentially, on our vertical axis, we have the global drivers that they identified as being most important. Here, they were geopolitical shifts, migration, and climate change as being the 3 most prominent things that are going to shape and change our global environment over the coming 15 years. On our horizontal axis, we have the drivers which they felt would be the most impactful in shaping the aid system itself. These were 2 drivers predominantly of localization, as well as aid funding and donor dynamics. And each of these 4 scenarios is a different combination of these drivers to explore the dynamics that we might be dealing with. One of the things we always say in Foresight is the goal is not to define the truth of what 2040 will look like, but rather it's a collective process to be able to explore the uncertainty that we face and to unpack our system itself and figure out how within that future we can shape it to craft and create a future that we want. So I'll start with our first scenario, aid on many paths. This is looking at a future in a global world that's defined by limited but still existent international cooperation, where responses to conflict, migration, and climate change may differ, but there are still some coordinated responses to those phenomena. It's also looking in the aid sector side on a model of what we're calling networked cooperation. These are new alliances, novel forms of aid, and innovative funding models. Within the aid on many paths scenario, we're looking at a future where there's a relatively stable and multipolar world with structured regional alliances and new forms of governance. Aid strongly aligns with regional blocs. Aid regionalization is a pretty heavy trend that we identify within the report itself. Local actors take a leading role in response, and new funding streams and economic models emerge as a result of organically grown networks from local and regional bases, which are able to tap different funding streams beyond the more formal channels of ODA. Here, INGOs remain as intermediaries within the system, providing different kinds of technical support, linkages, and other forms of advocacy and support within this broader system itself. As we move over to our second scenario on patchwork solidarities, we're staying within this global environment where, though it is still strained, there is still limited cooperation at international level. But rather than being in an aid environment of networked cooperation, we're in a future which we're calling survival of the fittest. Here is a system where the aid system collapses into fragmented and highly localized responses, where INGOs disappear or are paralyzed. There are varied levels of regional coordination and political instability and increasing inequality. Do-it-yourself solidarity based on local ownership is the most consistent form of aid that's seen in this scenario. This has some benefits. Responses are agile and context-specific. They're led by local actors to be able to respond adequately to community needs and demands. However, they're often transactional and short-term. There are spaces for adaptive and innovative solutions within those environments, but there's limited coordination in terms of cross-learning and across different geographies and different types of spaces. INGOs have a very limited role within this environment because there is such strong regionalization. Without a sort of global aid system, the role of INGOs varies widely depending on the purview of local actors and whether or not they seek that kind of support or not. In our final two scenarios on the bottom of the matrix here, we are switching into a global environment which is termed as empires in conflict. Here we have a fully fragmented world. Major powers turn into rival empires. There's strong borderization and militarization and limited international cooperation. In our third scenario, which we called Empires of Aid, this is essentially looking at a networked cooperation of aid alliances, but what that would look like in a geopolitical context that's defined by this second hypothesis. Here, aid is a geopolitical tool that serves state interests. The UN is fully sidelined or co-opted to be used as a tool of major powers. There's strict political constraints and control of NGOs at the local and national level, and INGOs act predominantly as agents of empire, with limited autonomy and independence. Aid is not neutral, it is a tool of power projection. Here in this scenario, when we talk about new alliances and networked cooperation, those alliances are not organically and locally grown the way they are in the aid on many paths scenario, but rather are predominantly and almost entirely defined by the geostrategic interests of major donors and major powers within the world. In our fourth scenario, which we've called the Great Unraveling, this looks at an environment within this empires in conflict global dynamic in a survival of the fittest hypothesis of the aid system. There's chaos and isolation with broad aid system collapse. Where there is humanitarian capacity, it creates major bottlenecks as people are forced into very tight and constrained areas as they're no longer able to access services in most places. There's a failure of many aid actors in the sense that aid actors themselves are not able to be sustained on the resources that are available, and INGOs almost entirely no longer operate. Local actors remain as the only form of solidarity with highly limited resources available. Many of them are not able to mount structured responses. And what is seen most are episodes of mutual aid, sometimes driven through faith-based networks, but often and almost always community-driven by proximity. Here in the Great Unraveling, this is obviously a scenario which no one wants to see. But one of the things we always say is that there aren't necessarily scenarios that are better or worse, because better or worse is defined by your own perspective. What might be better for the audience in this room is not necessarily what's seen as better by communities or local actors in other places. And one of the things that remained consistent and was really constant through the responses that we received is that mutual aid, community to community, friend to friend, family to family, that's something that continues no matter the context. Even in the most extreme environments, we see the incredible capacity of people to care for those around them. And as a result, when we're talking about the Great Unraveling scenario, often there is a sense for many people that this is a time to throw your hands up and give up. But in reality, what we see at this time is that there will still be people who are living in a world affected by crises. They will still be struggling as much as they can to help each other. And it behooves us all as individuals, not just as organizations, to think about ways in which, for people living in that reality, how is it possible for us to stand with them in solidarity? So with that very brief tour of some of the outputs in the study, we have one final question for you in terms of a point of reflection. You will be able to see this in a little bit more detail on your own devices. But what we would like to know is we want you to select up to 3 of these different areas. We are asking you and have presented, I think, 7 or 8 different areas of what we're calling transformations. These are different either activities, values, or things that organizations in the aid sector do. And what we want to know is thinking about all 4 of these scenarios, because many organizations who operate globally are going to have to learn how to deal and operate in multiple of these different futures. They will be occurring concurrently. And so how do you balance that? How are you able to be adaptable? And what key areas of investment do you think are required for your organization in order to be effective in managing these different futures? So there are quite a few to read, so I know this might take a minute or 2. So we will leave you in silence to think about that for a couple of minutes. In longer workshops and in things that we will be publishing in the coming months, we've been having this conversation about each of the different 4 scenarios, asking people in each different future what they would prioritize. And what's interesting to see is that every time we ask people that question, the responses are actually radically different across all 4 futures, which really defines the challenge that is presented to many of us. In a lot of the environments that we're working in, organizations, particularly those with a global mandate, are having to manage working in situations and scenarios that look more like the Great Unraveling, where there's very limited resources, very limited structure, very limited capacity to be able to support communities, as well as trying to take advantage and support situations that look more like the Aid on Many Paths scenario, where there's very strong local leadership, where there's infrastructure, where governments are at the forefront of making those decisions. And being able to operate in these 2 different environments, you sometimes need radically different capacities, different structures, different ways of working. And so what this question does, in terms of asking you to think about all 4 scenarios at once, is to essentially start the process of thinking about adaptability, how organizations can be robust in managing what is a very volatile time in terms of both the geopolitical environment in which we are living and in the aid sector in which we are working. So the top one that we have coming out strongly here is transforming how we mobilize resources. I think this has been a consistent theme as resources in the economic model of organizations drive so much of what we are able to do and what we can do. You should be able to see the responses as you scroll through of the other colleagues. But for now, I want to talk briefly about the next steps. So I've only presented a very small snapshot of what's in the report, so I strongly encourage you to go and read the rest of it. But very importantly, as we all know, policy papers aren't power shifts. So no matter how much we write and present, the only change that comes from action. What we're doing now in part of the Future of Aid project is working with actors to co-define pathways for transformation. Essentially, this is taking the form of consultations in many different regions where we're having conversations with local actors for them to first define how they would see a successful and effective response in each of these different futures. We're building in complementarity. The idea has always been from the foundation of this project that local actors lead and intermediary and enabling actors adapt and align to support and empower that kind of leadership. So after asking local actors this question of how they see an effective response, we'll then be asking intermediary actors, INGOs and the UN and other actors, how they can support and complement that rather than overshadow and challenge it. So that will be the format in which our consultations are taking place over the next few months. At the same time, we are going to be sort of building up to a discussion with enabling actors around donors and policymakers for how they set the environment and how they can try and incentivize positive change and transformation, while we're also building practical tools to enable organizations to undertake a journey of reflection and transformation based on these outputs. With that, that's the end of our presentation. We have lots of excellent speakers coming on the panel. So I will get off the stage to make space for them. But thank you all very much for your time and attention. And if you have any questions, I look forward to taking those later.
Thank you so much, Ailey. We will have a lot of time for questions later, so we will save them for later. From our side, from Nordkapp's side, when we chose to host this conversation together with partners, it was for a simple reason. The system is changing, and it's changing fast. And we need a space where we can talk honestly about what comes next. In Nordkapp, in addition to providing aid expertise and solutions, we see ourselves as conveners and system enablers. We work across governments, UN, civil society, research, and local actors. So when the ground shifts, Nordkapp has a responsibility to help hold the ring, to bring people together, not to defend the model as such. And the Future of Aid 2040 report shows us clearly that change is already happening in communities, in movements, in local networks, often long before it happens in global policy forums. So why is this debate so urgent? Well, we talk a lot about restructuring the aid system, reforms driven by funding cuts. But is the real crisis of aid about funding, or is it about legitimacy? Financing, structure, coordination, important conversations, but they cannot be the whole conversation. And the big question is, what should the content of aid be by 2040 for the people who live through climate shocks, conflicts, economic crisis, and displacement at the same time? Most people do not live single sector lives. They don't separate humanitarian, development, nexus. Those are our categories, not theirs. And as funding shrinks, we risk spending all our time redesigning the system and too little time imagining what we should actually do. So what does this report challenge us to do? You have just heard the scenarios. Aid on many paths, patchwork solidarities, empires of aid, the great unraveling. Different futures, but the message runs through all of them. Legitimacy will depend on local leadership, real solidarity, and the courage to rethink our role. And for Norway as a donor, as political voice, as part of a global community, this means asking, what kind of aid and systems are we willing to stand for? And what changes must we make now and not in 2040? So let me today introduce our panel. We have a very competent panel with us today. Elif is already introduced. Freddie Carver is director of the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI. Nadine Saba from the Akka network in Lebanon, working at the heart of community-led responses. Benedicte Bull, professor at University of Oslo and incoming NRC board member. Therese Pankratov from Innovation Norway. bringing perspectives on innovation and financing. Erik de Meers, head of the humanitarian unit at Norwegian People's Aid, with long experience from the field. We also have a recorded reflection from Rouida Tariq from NRC Sudan. Her voice speaks directly to the realities behind today's provocations or dilemmas, or whatever we call it. So let's open the conversation with a few provocations and dilemmas. And I'll ask the panel to take the floor. We have a tight time schedule, so we will discuss our way through a few dilemmas, and then we will open for some questions and comments from you in the end. Let's start with the first question that sits at the core of today's debate. If the old system has lost credibility, and even in some contexts, states and communities are bypassing aid altogether, finding their own solutions, then who defines humanitarian purpose when authority is plural? And also, localization has been promised for a decade, but power is not really shifting, is it? Is localization about implementation, or is it about leadership? So please, a few remarks from all of you, and I'll start with Nadine.
This is working.
You have to turn it on.
I think so.
Yeah.
So good morning, everyone. True, localization has been sold in a way that it is cheaper and has been implemented in a way that is we're changing the people who deliver services rather than changing who takes the decision. So at this point, it's been 10 years almost since the World Humanitarian Summit. And when I've read, the title, Looking for Change, and I think in the opening remarks it was said that it's the time to ask about that. My mind was like, wasn't this decision taken in 2016 when we had the World Humanitarian Summit to say we need to change and we want to change and we're ready to change and we're engaged to change and we have commitments to change? Why are we still now in 2025, almost 2026, asking if we need to change? So I believe that once I was in a conference and the lady was saying that moving from a decision to action is about confidence. What are we afraid of? What is it that we are not confident that it will happen if we change and we go to a true localization? So here I'm not coming with an answer, but I'm coming with questions that we ask ourselves as well when we are on the field. You've mentioned very rightly, people do not come to you with a need that is labeled humanitarian development. They come with a need. They want you to fulfill that need. You decide what you want to do out of it. They need access to water. You want to label it as a development project? Okay. You want to label it as a humanitarian project? They don't care. You want to label it as a peace-building project because they have fights over water? They don't really care. We care. We are creating those categories and we are complicating our lives and their lives with those categories. And we're making our work difficult for the people who do not work in it to understand what we do. So I think we need, it's more introspective for us to look into those than asking the others to change. The change needs to be in us. And we need to ask ourselves, what are we afraid of? Because what explains stalling this change for the last more than 10 years? I believe these have been discussed even more than that. What else could explain why we're not doing that, why we're not taking the step?
Thank you, Nadine. I will move on to Freddie. Freddie, can you hear us?
Oops.
Can Freddie hear us?
This change for the last more than...
Good morning. Are you talking to me?
Yes. I was giving you the floor.
The room is muted. I've been able to follow on the live stream, but there's like a 10 or 15-second delay. So I had to piece that together from seeing the turning. It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. Yeah, if someone can unmute the speaker at your end, that would be very helpful. Yeah, I'll keep going if I can get a thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
Perfect. Now I can hear you. Fantastic. It's always a bit alarming to see yourself looming over a room like this. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I'm sorry that I couldn't be in Oslo this morning. I'm very happy to be with you this morning, even virtually, because I think, as hopefully many of you will know, ODI Global has been working with NIA on pulling together a group of experts to really think about the state of the humanitarian system this year. We're calling it the Advisory Panel on the Future of Humanitarian Action. And what we were very keen that this initiative was not another process. We have enough policy processes, as the report talks about admirably, but a group that can act as a bit of a catalyst, hopefully, a provoker. There's been a lot of talk amongst the panel of guerrilla action in response to the fact that, as has been said by others, we all know that change has been discussed for many, many years and hasn't happened. I think in the run-up to the World Humanitarian Summit, ODI produced a report called Time to Let Go. And I think that the main point I want to make at this stage is it was time to let go. We didn't let go, but we lost control, if we ever had it. And I think that's the reality. And I think that's what's so helpful about the way that the report lays this out, is that no matter which scenario we're talking about, this fragmentation is real. And we need to, I think that the key messages that the panel has been trying to get across is this has happened already. And so the question is, can we catch up as an international system? And there's a vision paper which we can share if people haven't seen it, which is available on the ODI website. And what it talks about is a shift towards an ecosystem logic of thinking about aid. And there's been a lot of, I hear that rhetoric. I think it resonates really well with people. I think they sort of get it instinctively, but it's not necessarily obvious what it means in practice. And I think the most important thing that it means in practice is recognizing that the reality of the world across all parts of the world, whether we're talking about global north or global south, is really messy. And that an attempt to try and control humanitarian assistance from above is doomed to failure. And I think many of the problems and challenges that we've seen with the aid system, particularly this challenge of legitimacy, comes from an attempt to sort of pretend that we can create one simple framework, one simple set of principles, and roll them out across the world, and that we exist as a kind of neutral enterprise. And from a community perspective, particularly from the perspective of, I think, the global south, it's a kind of ludicrous starting point for thinking about humanitarian aid. They see the politics, they see the challenges, they see the hypocrisies. And unless we can be a bit more honest and open about those and recognize that the only way to kind of create that humanitarian space where independent humanitarian action that puts needs first, the only way to create that space is through a different kind of conversation. It's not going to come from the UN Security Council. I think everyone can recognize that that is the case. The UN Security Council matters, the multilateral system matters, but it needs to recognize that it's one part of a much more complex set of power. And I think if we're focused on a system that is helping the most vulnerable, those are the most in need, we need to engage much, much more with the realities they face and with the kind of the work that they are doing, which is the most important work to support themselves, as has been said by Ailey. And so recognizing that the kind of internationally funded and supported aid system, humanitarian aid system, is one part of a much bigger picture. And the questions we should be asking are not, how do we decentralize control? I think that's been the sort of, in some ways, the dead end of the localization discussion has been this idea that we can push power down. It's not about pushing power down. It's about recognizing that power exists elsewhere and then asking ourselves, how do we engage with that? How do we plug into that? How do we reinforce that? And then how do we manage the difficulties and the complexities that brings to how we operate as outsiders in different contexts? And I think that is the key mindset shift that needs to take place. And it has implications for everything, for funding, for coordination, for partnership, for delivery, for protection of norms. And I think there's a real kind of shift that we need to make around those lines. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Freddie. And if technology is with us now, we will hear a recording from the field. So let's see if it works.
Sudan has been shattered. Hospitals have been destroyed, services have collapsed, millions of people have been displaced. But this is not a story only of loss, it's a story of exceptional resilience. Young Sudanese refused to abandon their communities. When aid agencies evacuated, when banks shut down and government system failed, young people stepped in. Ordinary people, students, engineers, doctors, they organized themselves into what we now call the emergency response rooms. This was not charity, this was survival. It's rooted in the Sudanese traditions of what we call nafir, people helping people when no one else can. They became the social safety net. Thousands of communal kitchens were set up across the country. Every day they feed families who have nothing left. They became the emergency responders, the first line responders. Young doctors and nurses provide aid and medication in barely standing clinics under fire, treating wounds and guide civilians across and through dangerous evacuation routes. They became the engineers of survival. When power and water systems destroyed, young electricians and engineers repaired them, often in areas too dangerous for anyone else to reach. In Darfur region, especially around Al-Fasher, their courage has been pushed to the limit. As violence intensified and communications were cut, the world could no longer see, but young people stayed. They documented what they witnessed. Names, testimonies, evidence of atrocities, so that suffering of civilians would not disappear in silence. They helped families find each other. They created lists of displaced so that when aid comes, it reaches people most in need. They are not just helping people to survive, but they are protecting the memory and the dignity of their communities. Over the past year, through NRC Power Project, I have seen the resilience up close. We don't just deliver aid, we work hand in hand with youth-led groups, trusting them with funding, flexible funding, mentoring, coaching, and resources. I met young volunteers who reopened communal kitchens, helped detainees enroll in universities, and trained women and youth with disabilities to start their own businesses. Working with them has changed how I see humanitarian work. It proved that real solutions don't come from outside, they grow from within the community. And their work have been internationally recognized. The emergency response rooms were nominated for 2025 Nobel Peace Prize. But recognition is not enough.
We have heard a powerful voice on the field and how change can occur. But Benedicte, governance and accountability as drivers of change. What about it?
Click on the button.
The red one?
Yeah.
Here. Yeah.
On the side, no, on the side.
Yeah.
Does it work? No.
You can take this one.
No, I think, yeah. I didn't quite understand that question. I was supposed to be involved in accountability and drivers of change. So I'll just comment on the generals instead. And as someone that comes from outside of the sort of the aid community, I'm puzzled. Why are we still talking about aid as if it were one thing? I think that is part of the reason why I feel that this discussion, despite there are so many new factors, it goes a little bit in circles. It's about decentralization. It's about sort of whether it should be about priorities here or there, and it's about the eternal question: does aid work? I think that's an absurd question. I think it's like, would we ever ask, does the national budget work? We wouldn't do that. We would ask, does the money that we spend on, for example, preparedness towards climate changes, does that work, or anything else? And I think this discussion becomes a bit confusing, and particularly the question that was posed. About sort of priorities from where. I think it's always a matter of priorities of the donor countries and the politics here, and what we should do that we know works best in the communities where we operate. But those priorities are very different across different areas. I feel sort of talking about aid is as if we were talking about sort of plumping together the fire department with the general health services, and we talk about it as if it were one thing. So I feel it should be ideally also because I'm looking at this from more kind of the political point of view, and politics here in Norway, politics in the other main donor countries. How does this look, and why are we kind of losing the narrative that generates a stronger support for aid? And I think dividing those issues a bit more into, this is sort of the humanitarian aid is kind of the fire department. It's those that need to be there when there's crisis, but there's other parts of aid that has totally different purposes. And I think there's an overall challenge in that we're kind of losing the narrative that justifies aid on many fronts. Because it's kind of, the narrative that has justified aid is in part that we live in a deeply unjust world where there's losers and winners, and that creates kind of a deep kind of incongruence with the overall sort of the general ideas underpinning our Western societies, more liberal ideas that we should, the humanitarian ideas. And I think both this idea that we live in this world where there's major winners and losers, that challenged increasingly also by the global south itself, because this is eager to portray itself as the sort of the engines of growth where there's actually progress going on. And on the other hand, we're losing the idea of kind of liberal societies that are obliged to have based on humanitarian ideas. So I think that we're kind of, and on top of that, we have the eternal discussion within the aid community that kind of produces an idea that it's too much based on the power of the donors. It's too much based on our own idea. It's too unequal, as was also one of the options in the survey here, and with all these three forces at play, I think it's not strange that we see in increasingly opposition against aid in general in Western communities. Not so much here in Norway, but in some of the major donor countries, and of course especially the US at the moment, but there's also the similar processes. So I think that maybe we should start dividing these issues and look at kind of, we have all a responsibility for really being there when there's crisis, and keeping that discussion apart from one that is kind of the more overall development debate.
Thank you, Benedicte. And you talked about, you know, the fact that we do deliver results, and but at the same time we see that there is a crisis of legitimacy, as we talked about, and the funding crisis as such. What does that do to all of this? Is it kind of hampering the change that we need, or is it, and is kind of, you know, managing decline also an opportunity? I would like to ask Teresa to comment a little bit on that.
Thanks. Managing decline, an opportunity. I wouldn't say it's an opportunity. So within the work of innovation, we work on what we term as innovative financing. So these are various alternative ways of financing aid. I think that part of work is a really important part of the equation moving forwards, though it's not going to be able to completely bridge the funding void I think we see today. But the funding gap is not new. It's been growing consistently over the last few years. So we have colleagues across our sectors that have been working on identifying alternative ways of financing aid moving forwards. And that part of work is it helps reduce needs, and it helps draw in new donors, and that will be important that we as a community come together and work on those things. And through the work that we're doing in the Humanitarian Innovation Program, I have the pleasure of supporting multiple ongoing projects. As we're talking about the future of aid today, colleagues are gathering in at the Cool talking about carbon finance, for example, and can carbon finance help us fund some sectors within our response, enhancing access to energy, and greening our response, and so on. There are other types of credits with peace credits, renewable energy credits, to mention a few. We have colleagues that work on insurance schemes, for example. So how can we ensure that people affected by crisis have access to an insurance that is fit for purpose for them? And it sounds obvious, but one of the projects that we supported looked at why female smallhold farmers did not typically take up insurance. And one of the findings was that the insurance opportunities that were there didn't cover crops that females would typically farm. And so once you had an offer available that were fit for the crops that women would typically farm, then they chose to get insurance for that farm, for their crops. We have market-based approaches, as often framed within the work of innovative financing. It sounds a bit obvious, right, that we should have, there are local markets in every context in spite of the difficulties that people live there are faced, and it doesn't come across as an area of innovation necessarily. However, what we see in a lot of humanitarian response is that market-based approaches are being undermined by free distribution of aid. So they can actually be quite hard to establish. And so how do you establish market-based approaches for the areas of needs in the local context that can be addressed by market-based approaches at the same time as you have free distribution of aid for the services that we still need to continue to offer free of charge in each local context. And we see it work done well when you have it locally anchored, locally led. It can work well, it can alleviate pressure on donor financing, it builds resilience for the local communities. So there is a number of areas of work that will help us bridge part of the funding void that we see now. But we need to come together as a community to work on those. It requires a lot of upfront work, and there's a cost tied to that, to establish them and to help them work smoothly. And we also need to recognize that scaling them takes work. So once we've sold the first carbon credit, it doesn't mean that we're there. It's a lot of work, and then establishing the new carbon projects across the area, the humanitarian response areas. When we have market-based approaches functioning in one local context, doesn't mean that it's easy to scale that to the next local context. So we need to come together as a community and celebrate that scale at the same extent as we celebrate the innovation. So recognizing that this is a nascent area of work, we talk currently, there's a lot of talk about the various innovative financing mechanisms that are being thought about, that are being piloted and tested. Very few of them scale. The pilots are really small. So I would encourage us all to come together and collaborate on building them out and scaling them together.
Thank you, Teresa. And Freddie and Ile, if we look at what might be emerging funding trends, how do you think we can redefine impact while at the same time adapting to scarcity? Would Freddie like to start?
I can take this.
It's okay, I have one. You go.
Yeah. I guess lots of thoughts. It's been quite inspiring to hear the previous panelists. Also very, very inspiring to hear Roida, of course, describing the situation in Sudan, which on some level speaks to the great unraveling scenario, where when war started in April 2023, everybody left. All the internationals left. No actors were able to provide any kind of assistance. And what happened is what's actually transforming humanitarian aid right now. So while the great unraveling sounds like a worst case scenario, this is also, the birth of mutual aid. This is Nafir taking over for the humanitarian principles, replacing them quite adequately in an inspiring way. And I think that I guess what this makes me think of, and it's also reinforced maybe by the fact that at least 50% here had answered funding as one of the clear priorities here. It really sounds like we're fighting for our jobs. We're fighting for sustaining, maintaining a system that has grown massively over the last 30 years, has professionalized itself, but has become extremely expensive. The cost of coordination, the cost of maintaining, the cost of events like today. There are huge costs to maintaining this system, and I feel that a lot of the conversations are really about trying to see how we can find new funding to keep, in a way, the relationships of power that exist. And I think as I work for Norwegian People's Aid, it's a partner-based organization. We work with civil society, supporting them in trying to achieve the change that they want to see in their countries. And many of these partners we work with have taken on a role in humanitarian responses because there were needs, and they're engaged with their communities, and it made sense. And I think maybe to flag what's been said is that there are no silos for communities. The funding silos that we or the coordination silos that we work with are completely irrelevant for them in many ways. Maybe I think that the important thing maybe for me here is maybe to amplify the voices of some of these partners. Together with ODI, with the Rift Valley Institute, we were able to bring together about 30 local actors from Sudan and South Sudan in Kampala a couple of weeks ago, and they gathered, and they call their gathering Rethinking Aid for the Sudans and South Sudan. But we felt that there were a lot of important lessons there. And they've made it very clear that while the reset is an opportunity for all of us, it really needs to place the local communities, the local actors at the center. And we're not seeing this necessarily happening right now. What we're seeing is essentially the equivalent of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council redesigning the UN. It kind of feels that way a little bit. But what they've asked of intermediaries is that we ensure that our aid complements the local responses rather than defining the local responses. They've asked us to invest in transition, not in immediate withdrawal, but in transition, so that we ensure that services continue being provided throughout in this transition. They've challenged us to shift power and resources and bring them closer to the ground. And they've asked us to redefine partnerships, not in the way that we've done until now. And in my reading of the situation, I think we need to think even more transformatively about the system, the aid system as it exists.
So listening to what you have now said, are we able to do that with at the same time handling this funding shortage?
I think it depends on our approach and whether or not we take shortages as a driver to shrink or to change. And I think, unfortunately, what we're seeing at the moment is that people have a propensity to just shrink, to maintain the same power structures, the same dynamics, the same organizations, but to just reduce. This is a temporary fix. People seem to be under the, in my opinion, misguided apprehension that this is going to be short-lived, and that potentially, with a new, with a new election in the US, with a new, administration, that things will kind of go back to normal in a few years' time. And this is a wasted opportunity, to be honest. I think this question of whether managed decline can be an opportunity, I think it depends what's declining within the system and within the sector. For me, it always helps to think about this a bit like a table at the UN, if you will, where there are only so many seats around the table. And in the world, what happened at the World Humanitarian Summit when people said we're going to, start putting local voices at the table is we just added a few more seats. Like everyone shuffled along, no one left the table, everyone stayed and just got closer. And we added 3 more seats, but we only gave them 1 microphone. So there's visually, we've been performative in some of these ways, where you can see some of these things, but actually there was no more time to speak. And everyone else who was there before still had as much of a share of the conversation, maybe minus 2%, than they did before. And we seem to often be under the apprehension that we can achieve true goals of localization by kind of tinkering around the edges, by just maybe building a slightly bigger table and adding yet more people around it. But the more you do that, the more you dilute each person's vote, but you're not really, no one is stepping back. And I think, as we all know, anyone who has thrown a dinner party knows, anyone who's gone out for a coffee knows, at some point, power is not infinite. It's how you break it down that matters. So you can't just keep adding seats to a table. At some point, if you actually want to change the conversation, you need to change who gets to sit at the table in its entirety. And we don't seem to be willing to do that. I think, Nadine was pointing out, and one of the best things about speaking last on a panel is a lot of my colleagues have made these points for me in a much more eloquent way. But ultimately, unless we are rebalancing completely who has the microphones at the table and not just trying to pretend that adding a few more seats here and there changes the discussion, it doesn't. You're still around the same table, the same people are still setting the agenda. Who sets the agenda? Who defines what success looks like? Who still makes decisions about who gets to speak when? That, as we all know, ends up setting the tone and the culture and the structure and ultimately the outputs of the whole thing. And we, I don't think yet, have been prepared to unpack the aid system, which is a very wide umbrella term for what in reality is many different systems that come together, and really think about what it would mean if it wasn't just adding more people to the same conversation, but actually having a different conversation entirely. And I think that will define whether or not this is change or whether or not it's just the same thing, but on a smaller scale. And our understanding, even our ways of working, our use of email, the jargon that we use, the sort of barrier to entry we put in terms of levels of experience that are required for different positions, the way organizations set some positions as internationally recruited, some as all of these things, all of these constructs that we have established shape and define who has a voice in this process. And we won't be able to transform fully until we're able to take that right back down to the foundation and think about decision-making culture and be open ourselves to working differently, not just adding voices to the system that we've created, but actually being open to us having to be uncomfortable and work in ways that don't feel natural, that we weren't educated for, that we haven't been trained for, but that actually put local actors in a position where they shine and they define what's discussed. And just reducing money is not a way of achieving that. So it's an opportunity in the sense that it's a trigger for change in the system such that we haven't seen in the last decade. We didn't achieve those goals when the going was good. So now maybe let's see if when it gets rough, that can be the time for us to actually go back down to the bones.
Thank you. So Freddie, are we just expanding the table, doing things the same way, keeping the power and funding in the same way?
I think there is a definite. I think there is a definite risk that we do, undoubtedly. That is the instinct, I think, of most of the key actors, as we've just heard. People are very bad at giving up space. particularly at times when they're worrying about their livelihoods. And we can't underestimate the pressures that have, I know that many of you in that room are very aware of just how under pressure the agencies have been this year, and the number of people that have lost their jobs. And that is a kind of tiny issue compared to the experience of affected populations. But it can't be neglected when we think about why organizations struggle to kind of make more transformative decisions. So I think that we need to keep pushing this message that this is about relevance. I think somebody else said that. I think if we want a humanitarian system that is relevant and is meaningful and has any legitimacy with affected populations, then the change has to come. The change is there, as I said before. The question is, and it's not, I'm pretty convinced we need to keep the pressure on things like the reset. We need to keep having those conversations about how these policy processes can do better, engage more effectively with these realities. But change is not going to come through a process like the reset. It's going to come from a set of individuals in crisis-affected contexts that are visionary, that have the relationships. I think I'm very glad that our colleague from NPA talked about this discussion in Kampala that took place a few weeks ago. And I think the fact that the Sudanese and South Sudanese participants involved in that came away with that with their agenda for change, and a set of an impetus for a set of conversations that they want to have, and demands that they have for the system, I think is really important. And I think we need to find those places and those contexts where the conditions are right to actually say, let's not worry about a decision from Geneva or New York or Oslo or London, but let's just operate differently. And I think if we can start then to stitch together some of those experiences over time, we'll find that we've made more progress. And then I think the other piece, I really strongly endorse what's just been said about changing the way that these conversations happen. And I think we talk a lot about the donors, and donors have clearly a critical leadership role in setting incentives, in having leverage over the system. But we also need non-donor countries in the mix. If we're going to have a change that is legitimate, we need that genuine diversity of voices. We need the donors to be challenged by countries from the global south who will share their own perceptions of donor behavior, and a frank conversation about how we move forwards, and recognize that while the financing of the system is hugely important, it's not the only thing that matters. And as others have said, these get into uncomfortable territories. They challenge some of our assumptions about how everything gets done. But I think if we really want to adapt to the realities we're dealing with, these are the kind of conversations that are required. Thanks.
Thank you. And moving on to a third dilemma, and maybe also hopefully being a little bit provocative. I mean, what drives us may also be what drives change. And looking back to what we all put up as a major issue when we voted in the online questions earlier on, when we put funding as the main challenge, did we get lost somewhere in the funding discussions and structures that alienated people, forgetting what should be the underlying principles of our work? Solidarity, where does that stand in the discussion as of now? Nadine.
I want to get back the discussion to legitimacy rather than financing. What is happening now is on both sides of the spectrum, people do not trust the sector, do not trust the system. Neither people in providing aid, nor people who are receiving aid. The latter believe it's being unjust, that it's just, the same authority that is accepting or allowing, man-made disasters like wars, strikes, are the same ones that are sending money for aid. While this could stop and people would not need aid if wars are stopped. The second is people are feeling that the system is only about giving aid while it needs to go beyond that and go towards accountability, towards respect of international humanitarian law. And the other side of the globe, you have people who are feeling, what are you doing? What is this aid doing in these countries? Aren't we more entitled to our money, to our assistance than giving it to other people? So I think the financing and the solidarity is not about, money. It's about the behavior. It's about the communication. It's about the fact that we really did not learn anything from COVID. Remember throughout COVID, nobody is safe until we're all safe? Now, no. For each his own. I am safe, you do whatever you need to do. So I think that the issue is more around legitimacy, around the reconnecting with people, around stepping back from processes and going back to the basis. Why do we provide aid in the first place? Is it because, I need to clear my conscience and I send some money? Is it because I really believe that there is this injustice in the world and we need to be a bit more balanced? Why? And to go back, form follows the function. Why are we providing aid? And is it aid? Is it collaboration? Is it cooperation? Do we want to still name it aid? So when we talk about a paradigm shift, it needs to go back to the root of it. It cannot just go on the surface and say, I've expanded the table. Well, sometimes the whole table needs to change. Well, sometimes the whole room needs to change. It might not be in Oslo. It could be in Beirut. It could be in Nairobi. It could be anywhere else. So at this moment, I believe the question is, and I go back to the reset. For example, personally, I have different and mixed feelings. At one point, I'm like, this is another effort to restructure power into the hands of one or a couple of agencies. And then I'm like, okay, let's see if engagement would help. And we did engage. And then I'm like, we're still engaging. But is it going to be really effective? Or is it, for me, the sense of fake it till you make it? I really don't know. And it goes back to the same in terms of global solidarity. I think the question needs not to be asked to us. It needs to be asked to the people. The people who are giving money in terms of direct assistance, the people who are giving money in terms of taxpayers. And one needs to ask, why is public opinion shifting so much against aid and against providing this aid? And by this, we cannot talk just amongst ourselves. We need to open up to other sectors, other practitioners to understand, because it's not only us. And what's been happening is that we're speaking within a bubble. So in terms of solidarity, the question is not to be asked to practitioners only. The question needs to be asked to others. What pushes them to give? For example, what our colleague from Sudan said is exactly what we've seen in other crises. I've always mentioned the issue of the Beirut port explosion in 2020, where before any money coming from any institutional funding, people were on the ground, removing the rubbles, helping, providing food, because it's their community, it's their homes, it's their people. And at the same time, what I've noticed, because we've compared assistance that was provided to Lebanon after the port explosion and assistance that was provided to Lebanon last year during the war, people tended to give more when it was what could be labeled as a natural crisis, rather than when it's a war, when it's a political decision there. So I think it goes back beyond just our talk. It needs to go down to the behavior of people, to the perception of people, to how they see we as aid practitioners are doing our jobs. And apparently, people do not believe we're doing a good job. Otherwise, they would have given us more to do better. At the moment, I think we rank low on the index of satisfaction. If we want to do a satisfaction survey, I think from both sides, we won't have a very high, rating. So I'm not sure if I've given you enough in terms of solidarity, but I just said what I felt.
Absolutely, and very good, Nadine. I still would like to keep on to the question of solidarity a little bit more, because if we, as practitioners and also the donors, have kind of lost track on solidarity, what about the grassroots movements? Eric, can they be scaled without losing authenticity, for example?
So NPA engages generally in countries where there are conflicts and that are essentially about an imbalance or unequal distribution of power and resources. And we work with civil society actors, and we essentially support them on whatever their change agenda is. I mean, it's crucial that we find actors, we share values and we understand what change they want to bring about. But our aim is mostly to support their agenda for change. And what we found, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's in Sudan, whether it's in Myanmar, what we found is that when there is a crisis, they're the first ones to respond. And so we've, in a way, we've had internal conversations and conversations with donors around the humanitarian principles, and in a way that concern that well, these are political actors, and their neutrality is questionable. And whether that, is that a concern around their ability to provide meaningful humanitarian assistance within the humanitarian principles? And I think, in a way, I feel that questioning, that debate has almost been put to sleep because of Sudan right now on some level, but other experiences. And hopefully it is. I mean, we all have political convictions, and we're all engaged, and we're all solid, whether we feel solidarity towards Palestine or we all have an engagement, and yet we're capable of providing principled responses that by and large reach those that are most in need, those who need the greatest protection. By doing this with local actors who best understand what the needs are, what the vulnerabilities are, we feel that this is a way of standing in solidarity with what's happening on the ground I would say in a much more genuine way than we perhaps are doing from within a perspective of the humanitarian system. I think there's something there that is challenging and questioning and opening a new reflection. I think we've been hiding behind the ways in which we work, and I think that that needs to be changed. I think solidarity actually should be one of the additional principles to add to the package of the humanitarian principles.
I want to intervene. Why do we want to scale them? Why are we creating, we are replicating a certain business model of an NGOification? Why? If there is a good grassroots network or movement or whatever that is delivering, why do I want to turn it into an NGO with all the bureaucracy of it? Because what's been happening is that we're replicating a certain business model that already from the get-go put aside, local organizations, or then molded them in a mold that's not always the best one in their context. So it's also another question, why do we want to change them? If there is a grassroots movement, maybe accepting, those different ecosystems that we've talked about, it's not, one system, it's different systems. Sorry.
You're welcome. Well, we like putting things into boxes, huh? And we have also put solidarity into the boxes or the scenarios. Ili, a few last comments from you on the solidarity dilemma.
I think I get into trouble here because I wouldn't add solidarity to humanitarian principles. I would have it as the only humanitarian principle. So I find I myself am a deeply unprincipled person and highly practical, which has many downsides, which are pointed out to me often, which is good. But there is also an upside in that it allows you to see the world in a very realistic way. And I think this is part of our problem, is that we're not particularly honest, to be honest, in these conversations. I say this slightly hesitantly in NORAD, but I find that, donors because the people who come to work every day are genuine in their commitment to solidarity, that can sometimes be scaled at an operational level, but into something that I don't think is particularly realistic. The World Humanitarian Summit is a prime example of this. I genuinely feel like a lot of donors showed up at that table and they were like 25% directly to local organizations. Like, yes, sounds great. Sign the paper. And then before they even like got on the plane out of Istanbul, they were like, you know what, let's do as locally as possible. Like, we need to hedge that a little bit. And before their planes even landed, I think they realized that wasn't going to fly in their domestic constituents. They have political obligations in their governments, in their home countries. And I think we're not very good, and I think this stems partly from our commitment to principles, at understanding that there are lots of different roles for different kind of actors in this space. And the people who will be successful are the communities who can understand that and take what they need from different groups. Maybe we don't all need to have the same principles. Maybe donors who are still willing and have tax money to spend, they are always going to be driven by domestic constituents. That's reality. These people are elected. It's tax money that's gathered here in Norway. It has to be spent according to government priorities here in Norway. Can that money ever truly be localized? I don't actually know that it can. How much, Norway is a particularly progressive country, so maybe we should talk about the UK. How much are the UK citizens willing to say that a portion of our tax budget is going to be decided by people entirely not within our country? There is no evidence that we're willing to do that so far. I don't think that's going to change. So I think the job for local communities is rather to say, okay, you know what, my priority, at least temporarily, aligns with the priority of the British government, so I'm going to take some money from there. But I'm going to look at other ways to get money for everything else I need, because they're not going to change their priorities based on my work. I think governments need to think about how practical that really is, because we waste a lot of time talking about things that I don't think are politically feasible, and it takes the time of people like Nadine who have to deal with that continually for 10 years, having this same conversation. It's a lot of time and energy to dedicate to that with very little ultimate change. So I think we need to have some reflections around solidarity and think about what is genuinely feasible. And if things are not feasible, then let's accept that. Let's take some of it off the table. There can still be some advocacy work to change it. I don't mean to dismiss that. But in the short term, let's understand where those parameters are and then be more creative about how we can use that money for communities to really deliver what they need. And I think a little honesty goes a long way in terms of solidarity, because I think this also speaks to the legitimacy problem. The more and more you say something without making it come true, the less and less people believe you. So I think being more open to the diversity of different ways of working in the system is key to solidarity. And that's some of the opportunities that are included in things like patchwork solidarities. Yes, in that scenario, there's no structured formal system. Yes, some actors will fail in that scenario. It will be a more radical change. But I think it lays open and lays bare maybe an opportunity to say to local communities, here is a full menu of what's available. You don't have to have it all streamlined through one centralized, principled, formal system into which all major actors buy in and agree. And if you don't buy in and agree, you're not allowed in. We are quite exclusionary in that way. Maybe it's better to just have this wide open smorgasbord where you can say, depending on what you need in that time, here is what's available. And that's what solidarity means instead. So I think for me, that is a huge part of how we can rethink about the system a little bit. And it goes right back to this idea of needing maybe even a different room more than a different table and defining that in that way.
Thank you. So a very last question to the panel and last short inputs before we open for questions as well. I have heard throughout now that we need transformation. But who starts? And how do we actually measure success? Benedicta, would you like to start?
I'm not the right person to ask that, but I would just like to make a few other comments, because I'm really happy about that last intervention, because I sit here as kind of an outsider, feeling that I really don't understand the system. And I'm also quite curious about this word ecosystem, because it appears as if the sort of humanitarians are a kind of specific species that operate outside of the political realities where the rest of us live. And so I think that this kind of, and also these ideals about that it should be run from the bottom up and all of that, we know that that's not reality. We have to find compromises, and the current world that we live in is not very friendly towards any kind of aid budgets. It's kind of it's a tough reality. It's geopolitics. Much more is based on the sort of security interest, the immediate interests of each country. So I think that it's really good to sort of put the finger down to the soil, as we would say in Norway. But I would like to sort of just put in another sort of reality check, and that is the fact that the resources in this world is increasingly amassed by private billionaires and large corporations, and not even those states that are kind of accused of being the dominant and those that are ruling the world. It's the resources amassed by the world's richest have increased by 17 times over the last 25 years, while the similar kind of resources of states have increased by 3 times. So it's not even, it's a deeply unequal world where we live in, and sort of I think that in this world, I think it's super important to mobilize different, sort of, to just go a little bit back to solidarity, mobilize different narratives to sort of create an understanding of how we can contribute to change and sort of tap into different resources, but also be really concerned about that we need another narrative to kind of legitimize the system, and I think point one would be to open the discussion for other actors, and not sort of not just put a few chairs on the table from those that are in the system but in a different position, but open the discussion much more. And I think that in order to transform, I think it's really, really important that the system is more realistic and more open to widely different voices.
Thank you, Benedicte. So solidarity with realism, and also making sure that we have the right legitimacy, Freddie. How do we do that? Short in the end.
I'll try and keep it very short. I also really like the points that I think Ailey made. I think, going back to what I said before, and I agree with that call for a reality check. We're not going to have a sort of kumbaya moment where everyone says, "Oh, this is what we needed to do all along. We just didn't see it." That's not the way of the world, and it's certainly not the world we live in right now. So I think, but I'm really taken with that notion of providing communities with options. I mean, that's what they do anyway. That's what people are doing. People are making choices all the time. We're kind of again, that's really at the heart of this notion of moving away from ecosystems to ecosystems. It is about recognizing we're not cut off, and it is about recognizing that others have the real kind of power and authority. So I think being opportunistic about demonstrating that there are different ways to work, there are different ways to engage, there are different ways to offer those opportunities to people, and to be in a very kind of focused learning mindset, and so that we can find those opportunities, because political opportunities will also exist. There is not some, as I say, I think it's very unlikely that we can create some grand political coalition around a reform sector, but I do think there will be opportunities that arise. There are points of common interest from states with very different perspectives. So I think we need to be opportunistic everywhere. if that isn't too much of a cop out, but I'll leave it there.
Okay, so let's be opportunistic, but let's also open up for a few questions. I'll start with the audience, and then I have a couple of questions from the online participants as well. We can use the microphone for the audience. Yes, please.
Hi.
It's good if everyone presents themselves as well.
Hi.
To hear who you are.
Yeah, my name is Nikolai Higdon. I work here at NORAD. I just want to, you asked whether it's a funding or a legitimacy question. It's clearly both, and I'm glad you turned the conversation into this, because we have to talk about ODA. ODA is almost mentioned in the report, and ODA is fueling somewhere between 70 and 90% of the development system, and at least, especially the humanitarian system, probably 90% of the salaries of the people in this room. And we, these sort of agencies, are standing now in the middle of two strands of critique. You have the progressive critique, which I very much hear today, but then you also have the populist critique, which is very strong as well. And I think the progressive critique tend to view the aid system as something of a global public good, as a universal resource or something like that. But that's something that's been sort of tarnished by the interest of the donors, etc. But that's very much the normal, except for a few years in the 1990s and the beginning of 2000s. ODA has always been a foreign policy tool, very much. So, and always shaped by the interest of the donors. So, no matter how much sort of progressive rhetoric we've sort of layered around it, but there's never been anything like a very much foreign-funded project where sort of you let go of control. It's never been historically. So we have to remember that. But I have to say, I agree in the whole, I agree in the intention here and the transformation of the system, etc. It's very anachronistic, it's very asymmetric, and we need to empower those closest to the problems. But on the other side, we have the populist critique, and I just have to raise it because, from actors and forces within our own societies, right? And they are very much saying that, this is a waste of money, you're not solving any wars. If anything, you're prolonging them by bringing resources into these conflicts. You build up these structural, the parallel structures, you undermine the societal contract in these societies. It is really expensive, as you mentioned, et cetera, et cetera. And our taxpayers' money should go to, solving the problems at home, charity at home, which is really gaining momentum these days. So what is your message to the domestic audiences in these countries who stand for 70 or 80% of some of this funding? And what is your message to the Gulf states and other high-income countries outside of the OECD, for example, who are not stepping up for this transformation? That was my long comment and question, sorry.
Thank you. Who would like to respond?
I can start, though I'm sure my colleagues will have other things to add. I think it goes back to this point about honesty. I think ODA is a huge proportion of what pays the salaries people in this room, pays my salary too, indirectly, but that's a big part of it too. But it's not as big a proportion of what communities themselves receive in terms of resources. So remittances are much larger, so they get money through faith-based networks. So if you're looking at that level, ODA is actually quite a small proportion. And I think this speaks a bit to the bubble that we find ourselves in. Sometimes we think we are very, very, very important, and to some communities we really are. But to most, it's one tool in their arsenal that they use to manage their lives. But I think the key thing about ODA is it will continue to be important. Many governments will continue to use ODA as foreign policy. It's not disappearing. I think sometimes in this year, because it has fallen off so completely, we forget that even if ODA is half, that's still going to be like 40 billion a year. It's a huge amount of money that is still being spent and allocated. And to me, I would say to domestic audiences, I think the liberal rhetoric that's put on top of aid it comes from a good place, but as I said, it's not genuine in terms of what's actually achievable. This idea that ODA could ever have not been political, which I think we sometimes try and pretend it is. I find it very hard when people talk about neutrality in terms of aid, because to me, money that comes through ODA is never neutral. I know that's a personal opinion, but I find that very difficult to sort of stomach. And I think domestic audiences find it hard because they see that, they see us trying to kind of sell it in both ways. They see us trying to sell it as, it's, we're impartial, we're neutral, it's, being driven by communities, it's not being, driven by us, that's the goal, that's where we want to be, while also often trying to placate a domestic audience by trying to say, but it's good for you too, right? Because it's also good for you in terms of stopping migrants arriving at borders in Europe, increasing your global security. By feeding more people there, you're feeding less people here. And these two things, they're not always in conflict, but there's always tension between how we're trying to market that. And I think for me, that's why I sort of made the point about honesty. I think if it was up to me, I think within the aid sector, we should just say, like, ODA is a political tool that's used as part of foreign policy. But local communities, like, take it or leave it. Like, when it suits your interests, amazing. Then take the money, you use it how you want to deliver for the communities you need. When you see it as being in conflict to achieving your ultimate goals, potentially by, you know, prolonging conflict or by reinforcing a side of a conflict that you don't agree with, then, you know, look elsewhere. But I think trying to walk this tightrope has left us in a very difficult position in terms of domestic audiences, and also in terms of, as Nadine was saying, in terms of the communities we serve. They see this too. I mean, they see aid being delivered with a massive US flag. You know, when was the last time you saw a USAID-funded project that wasn't covered head to toe in USAID branding? There's a reason they're not shipping that food in an unmarked sack, right? The purpose is that it has. I was at a USAID conference about the work in Sudan in Nairobi a year or two ago, and they were asking the question, like, what do communities think about the US giving this aid? Like, even the fact that they're asking that question demonstrates that they are seeking to get something from that. It's transactional. It's not, you know, we are not in a position where we are giving that aid freely. And I think pretending that we are is leading to a crisis of legitimacy with the communities we're serving, and like a crisis of confidence in the countries who are funding it. So I think we should just stand up and call it what it is.
Benedicte, and then I'll open for another question.
Yeah, thank you, Nikolai, for formulating the point I was trying to make initially. I think the first point about sort of how to bring those that are not sort of bring China into the discussion of humanitarian aid. They are kind of presenting themselves as the great kind of benefactors of especially African countries, but they're very, very, I mean, minuscule in terms of humanitarian aid and other things. Bring the Gulf states in, bring all of those states. But I think, I think that the sort of domestic legitimacy problem is significant. But I'm not quite sure if I agree with you that there's very little that everybody also in the donor countries think badly of humanitarian assistance. The most surveys I've seen actually shows a quite significant support among domestic sort of audiences in Western countries, even in the US, for humanitarian aid. And so I think that can also be I mean, focusing on achievements, I think, is still important, because I think in these kind of debates, we tend to be very extremely self-critical, or not we, I'm not part of it, but sort of there's an extremely self-critical debate, and that's good in a way, but there's also sort of a way of generating more solidarity. But one other way of kind of bringing this in, I think we should discuss humanitarian issues also in relation to a lot of other policy issues. I've worked quite a bit on the topic of sanctions, for example, that generate enormous humanitarian consequences. But those issues are very often discussed separately. At the moment, I work most on Latin America, and especially on Venezuela. We see maybe a US military intervention. I've seen very few discussing the possible humanitarian consequences of that. So bringing the humanitarian issues up also in other discussions. I know that the migration issue is kind of delicate, and one has to be very careful about how to formulate that in order not to sound kind of sort of help them where they are so they don't have to deal with the people coming here. That's not a kind of discourse that humanitarian organizations would take on. But I think bringing those aspects into several other policy debates, and not be shy of also kind of showing that there is actually quite a high level of support for it.
Thank you. Long answers reduce the time for questions, but let's have two questions at one, and then like 2 sentences answers from the panel. There's a question here online that says that your consultations center global South voices, but the scenarios still reflect global North power dynamics. And how do you reconcile this with the local-led vision? There's one question, and let's take another question if there were some. No. Actually, there was none. So then, short responses to the last
Sure. I would just say I'm very happy to take that discussion up offline. So whoever submitted it online, you can email me for a longer conversation. But I think the ultimately, one of the things that we want to focus on is we are within this aid bubble, and while we are trying as much to integrate these different perspectives, I think national debt and sort of the structure of international loans, trade barriers in general, and the way in which that affects the transition of money and flow of goods, sanctions, there are all of these political components which, to be honest, would have a far bigger impact than ODA itself. However, as I said, ODA that's funded and the actors that are funded from that system is still a significant proportion of money. It's a huge driver of culture within sort of formal aid decision-making space. And so I think it's still important. And within the scenarios themselves, they are very much a reflection of the voices who were local but also international who fed into that to the study. But one of the things, because we're talking about transformation, one of the things we wanted to really ensure is part of this discussion is, spaces where, and I'm going to use this, I think, to answer my last question as well, so you can skip me. But the idea, I think, of, who leads on transformation is wherever there's agency. And we often wait to see who else is going to go first. And ultimately, you mentioned courage in your introduction to this panel. Ultimately, it will be the actors with courage who step forward. And we think that there is still a lot of space within intermediaries, within the international aid system, to find that courage and to leverage this period of what is intense personal pain often for people working in organizations. As Freddie said, people are losing jobs. It's personal. We don't discount that. But let's try and transform that into purpose. And I think the goal of the scenarios was not to make a future, to envisage a future, which I firstly don't think is realistic, but also is not necessarily positive, where there is no international solidarity and no space for international actors within that frame, but rather to reflect on how the space and capacity for change at international and intermediary level can be positive and can be an opportunity. And change and transformation is often painful, but that doesn't mean it's not without purpose and not without a good endpoint and goal. So we wanted the scenarios to be able to be used by everyone to think about a collective vision of what that means, even if it means completely changing the table and changing the room. There is still space, I think, for anyone who wants to put effort into acting in solidarity to do so.
Thank you. We are wrapping up with a few takeaways from NORCAP's Executive Director, Benedicte, but please, the panel can just sit and we would like to thank you properly afterwards. So, Benedicte, please.
Let me see. Does this work? Yeah, it sounds like it's working. No, I must say that this has been a very, very interesting discussion. It's actually, I would say, it's one of the most interesting discussions I've attended for several years, because I think we are a bit navel-gazing because it's us sitting talking to us. But at the same time, I think we are touching upon some very, very important questions, and we are challenging ourselves. So this is so important. So first of all, I just want to thank, on behalf of both NORAD and NORCAP, I want to thank IARAN, and you are representing IARAN here, so I want to thank you, Eili, for kickstarting these very, very important discussions through your report. And I would, of course, also like to thank all the panelists for important contributions. And I was trying to sort of say, okay, how can I sum all of this up? There's been a lot of different, very, very important points being made. But I was thinking that, Teresa, you are challenging the way how we are financing the whole aid system. And you're trying to come up with very more innovative ways of doing it, and very much being market-based. And that is also extremely important, because the thing is that when we come in with our aid, we interrupt the local market system, and thereby we destroy the livelihoods in a way. Yeah? So I think this is extremely, extremely important. Then both Benedicte and Freddie, you also touched upon, the system itself. that we need more simple systems, but we also need to see ourselves in the bigger system. That we tend to see ourselves as very sort of isolated. We are riding on our white horse saying we will save the world, and we sort of lose the bigger perspective in terms of all the other actors that are out there, and also we lose a bit the perspective of those we are there for and those we are there working with. Ailey, you said a lot in terms of how aid should not, how we need to just transform completely the way how we look at aid. Not about how we deliver, but it's actually about how we look at aid. You're also challenging the humanitarian principles and saying, in the end of the day, isn't this about solidarity? Extremely, extremely important. Because at the same time, we're also trying to use sometimes the humanitarian principles to also justify why we are doing it the way we are doing it. And when we now also hear, and what we've been discussing is that we need to change the way how we will be doing it, then we might also change the way, we use these principles and how we will, if we should take them forward or if we need to really rethink around this. But also it's interesting, it said that, yes, there's a lot of support for humanitarian, the acute emergency actions, in the community as such, around the world. And I think it goes back to the basics. We don't like to see starving children. We don't like to see people being killed. We don't like to see people not getting the emergency assistance that they need, because it's something very deeply rooted in ourselves, yeah? It's about solidarity again. And I think this is what we need to really work on as a basis. And Nadine, you are questioning all of us,
And myself.
And yourself.
Yeah, myself.
Which is, I think, I also question myself the whole time, maybe sometimes also too much, and maybe we shouldn't question ourselves the whole time, but at the same time it's extremely important. For us in ORCAP, and the reason to why we joined this important work and try to see how can we help this, or not help the report, but what can we inject into the report. It's also because in the end of the day, our mission is about how do we empower, how do we protect people affected by conflict and climate change. It's quite simple, but it's about that empowerment. It's about that protection. And the empowerment goes back to, so how do they become agents in their own lives, is what you've been saying, Nadine, throughout this. And I just want to tell a small story from North Syria, where we worked on this project, very much in terms of empowerment. And the thing is that when we come in with this big humanitarian system, it's so complex that, normal people and nobody outside really understands what we do, because we use our own lingo and we have this great bureaucracy and da-da-da-da. So for people to have their own opinion, we have to then translate how we work to the people. So we have been doing this then, and then we took this group of representatives and said, this is about housing. It's about which housing solutions would they pick? And the international community had come up with 3 different housing solutions. And they've been running especially one of the housing solutions throughout the whole north of Syria. And then we did this work with this group, and they said, in the end of the day, they said, no, but that's not the housing solution we want. We want this housing solution, and very good reasoning for why they wanted it. But we had to take them through a big process, because they needed to understand the way how we were speaking. They needed to understand the process in itself. And it says something to me about, how complicated we have made things. So in the end of the day, the reconstruction on shelter for northern Syria had to be changed. The people's voice was being heard, and it was actually also the cheapest solution. So we saved a lot of money. But to me, that's what empowerment is about. It's about being agent in your own life, and we all want that for ourselves. And that's what we should want for the people we work for. So thank you very, very much for this very engaging debate, and I look forward to the next round. Let's see where we can end that one. Thank you very much, everybody.
So we will just end by saying again a big thank you to our panel. It's just a very small appreciation to all of you. More symbolic than